Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar. Here today, we are talking about data validation for enterprise ML, how to use great expectations with Hopsworks, and in particular, Hopsworks Feature Store. So my name is Victor Jufrey. I'm the software engineer here at Hopsworks, and I was the lead developer on the integration with great expectations, with a lot of contributions also from Mois Meister. So basically, companies that are starting to do AI these days, they have a problem because they have a lot of different data sources and they're trying to build a few different use cases using these data. And what that translates into in essentially a lot of data engineers have to create data pipelines between the data sources and the different use cases. So it can be either data scientists that are trying to put new models into development, starting to generate some training data sets, or models maybe are already productionized and driving value for the company, or maybe it's a business analyst that just wants to write a report that is a bit more data driven than usual to the senior management or to the stakeholders to drive better decision. And the problem that data engineers have is obviously that if you have to set up a whole new pipeline every time, it takes time. You have to validate all the data every time because you want to guarantee high quality data to your team. And that's just not going to scale well because it means that you have one pipeline to maintain per use case, and that means one validation per use case. And so it's going to be expensive to create, and it's going to be essentially unmaintainable. So the way Hopsworks and its feature store is trying to solve the problem is by creating a much more centralized place to write the high quality feature. So that's what we call the enterprise feature store. And essentially the idea is that we have data engineers that are going to read data from the different data sources that are going to run their feature engineering pipeline, that are going to validate their data, and then they're going to write it to the feature store. And what that means is that the feature store is going to be this repository, this database that is available for all the downstream user with already all the high quality data there. And so people that are the user of this feature are going to be either the data scientist or the ML engineer or the business analyst. And they are going to be able to share and reuse all of this feature. And that means that instead of having a pipeline per use case and a validation per use case, now you only have a pipeline per feature. And that means that you're cutting down drastically on the number of data engineers that are needed to produce this high quality feature and maintain them. And in addition of that, Hopsworks is providing a lot of extra values of having all your feature in the same place, because Hopsworks is allowing you to search them and to version them. It's going to also give you some statistics on some of the features. It's going to allow you to understand a bit more how your models are connected to your different features. So really, by creating this central feature store, you're enabling a lot of added value to the downstream user, and you're reducing the burden on your data engineering team because they only have to validate data once, they only have to write one pipeline for every feature, and that is helping with maintainability and consistency. So that's why the feature store is such a great tool for MLOps, and it's something that we are hoping to see being a bit more widely adopted in years to come. And so why are we doing data validation with great expectations? So data validation, great expectation is a Python library that is essentially allowing you to build some kind of documentation about your data. So, and we think this is exactly the right way to do data validation. And this is also the way that works with Hopsworks. So that's why we're really excited to build this integration with them, because we think it's going to drive a lot of value for our users. So how does Great Expectation works is that essentially, so the data engineers are going to read the data from the raw data from the different sources that they have. They're going to put them into data frames. They're going to do the data engineering, and then we are going to need to validate those data. And the Great Expectation way of doing that is to define expectations on the data. So expectations have a type. So here, for example, expect column minimum to be between. And so it's telling you, okay, what are you going to do? You're going to compute the minimum of a column. So the metric is the minimum of this column. And then you provide a bunch of keyword arguments. So here it's a column on which you should compute the minimum. And also you're going to define success criteria. So when Great Expectation is going to validate your data, it's going to look, okay, I'm going to compute the minimum on this column, and I'm going to see does the value that I obtain is between main and the minimum and maximum, the success criteria that I've given. And it's going to produce a result with a lot of information about how the validation went and essentially whether it's a success or not. And that's essentially the core principle behind Great Expectation. And that way you are enabled to keep building a documentation about how your data were fulfilling those expectations as you start validating more and more your data frames. And so obviously you have maybe for a numerical column, for example, you will have a few different expectations. So you might be computing the minimum, the maximum, the mean, the standard deviation. Maybe you want to also know the number of null values. So you have maybe 5, 6, 10 expectations for a column, and then you maybe have a dozen of columns or several dozens of columns in your data frame. So directly you get the pretty long list of expectations, and Great Expectation collects them into what they call an expectation suite. And a suite is used to validate essentially an entire data frame instead of just running a single validation. And this suite produces a report that has a few metadata, but essentially is a collection of the results of these expectations. So that's the concept that are going to be key to interface with Hopsworks. One thing that I want to emphasize is that at Hopsworks, we think that Great Expectation is doing an amazing job. And so we want you to reuse as much of Great Expectation as possible. And in particular, we think their API is great. And so that means that we think you should do everything that has to do with defining data validation using Great Expectation APIs. And that allows you to essentially reuse anything that you've learned from Great Expectation in the integration with Hopsworks, because we don't create any additional burden or additional requirement. We just let you work with standard Great Expectation objects and the standard Great Expectation API. So how to use Great Expectation with Hopsworks? So the first thing maybe we should say is that why do we want to use Great Expectation with Hopsworks? And the problem that we were trying to solve is essentially how to reduce this garbage in, garbage out problem that people that run databases and work with data are used to see. And some feature store have opted for the way of like monitoring what's inside the feature store or monitoring what is getting out of the feature store to check the quality of the data. But we think that it is not a good way to solve the garbage in, garbage out problem. Like what we need to do to solve that and to at least reduce the amount of bad quality data is to validate the data at the input. So what we want to do is have great expectations run just before we write the data to Hopsworks, because we know that like once it's been written to Hopsworks, Hopsworks provides all these great capabilities for every downstream user, the data scientist and the business analyst that maybe don't have the time and don't have the resources or knowledge to read them raw data and make sure that they are correct. And so they want to know that like, okay, it's in Hopsworks, it's high quality data, I can search them, I can see the different versions that are available, I can see the statistics. So we think that we need to validate the data before we write them to Hopsworks to make the best of the feature store capabilities. Also, because that means that every pipeline that comes out of the feature store doesn't necessarily need to include validation. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need any kind of monitoring, but it means that we don't have to use data validation maybe to the same extent or to do the same thing. So that's how we think that great expectations should interface with feature groups, with the feature store. And the right API to the feature store is essentially this feature groups entity. And what is a feature group? That's essentially a data frame that you keep inserting data in. So what happens is that you have a feature engineering pipeline that is running every day, and it's reading raw data from your different data sources and computing this new updated feature, creating a data frame from these features and trying to insert them into a feature group. So the feature group is essentially the same data frame with the same column, and you just insert new data every time to it. So that's just abstraction that you should have in mind, is basically a data frame that you keep inserting data in. And so how does the feature group and the expectation suite interact is that essentially you just have to attach an expectation suite to a feature group to enable data validation. So the expectation suite can be a purely great expectation object. We at Hopsworks have made the decision to interface with the native great expectation so that you can reuse as much of the API as you can. And so you can either attach the expectation suite on creation of the feature group, or you can attach it later with the save expectation suite method. And that enables automatic validation on insertion. That means that every time you will try to insert a data frame in this feature group, or in this version of the feature group rather, Hopsworks will allow you to retrieve the expectation suite, run the validation, and then upload the report directly to Hopsworks again. So really, you have all of that is done automatically in your behalf every time you run insert. So the code that you write is the same as if you didn't provide the expectation suite, but we take care of the validation for you, essentially. When you are saving an expectation suite, you can choose basically between two ingestion policy. So the default one that is maybe for prototyping or for early stage project is the always ingestion policy. And it basically means that you should always write the data to Hopsworks independently of what data validation, whether data validation successes or not. So that makes sense because early in the early stage, you don't want data validation to be a hindrance. You want to make quick progress, and you also want to start getting to know your data. And we think that great having this policy of running the validation, but just don't make it a hindrance is great in that sense. But for more demanding environment where you have maybe stricter rules in terms of data quality, then we have this different keyword strict. That means that only save the data if the data validation is a success. So when you call insert, the expectation suite will be retrieved, the validation will be run, and the validation report will be also uploaded, but it will only start the insertion job if the entire data validation was a success. So that's really a benefit of removing the boilerplate from the data validation logic and enabling a simple keyword to match two different type of environment and really making it easy for you to switch from one to the other. So obviously, if your data validation safe is failing, you might want to be alerted of that. So Hopsworks UI allows you to set up alerts to your email or to your Slack account if such a thing happens, so that instead of having your boss telling you that you have to come to his office as soon as you arrive, maybe you get an email at 2 a.m. to tell you that your feature engineering pipeline has failed and that you maybe need to fix it as soon as possible. So it's great for data engineers' work-life balance, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Yeah, and the last thing in the integration with Great Expectation that we want to put forward is really the fact that now your expectation suite, your data, and your validation reports are all living in the same place. They're living attached to this feature group. And so when you go on the feature group page, you can see the validation reports and the validation results. And we have designed the Hopsworks interface to essentially fulfill two things that we didn't really get from Great Expectations. So Great Expectations allows you to build an HTML documentation of your data, and that's great and very useful, but it doesn't really fulfill the two ways in which we were using Great Expectation report when we started building this integration. Is that when you have a job that is running every day, maybe, you want to quickly look at the validation report history and see, okay, everything is going fine. And I want to see the date. I want to see whether it was a success or not. And I want to see what action was taken, like were the data rejected or were they ingested? So that gives you easy feedback really quick on what happened for this particular feature group during your feature engineering job. And if you want to know a bit more information about a particular report, you can have a really quick summary where you can see which expectation failed, which expectation raised an exception, and get really this easy feedback, especially when you're prototyping on, okay, what do I need to fix? Like, where did it go wrong? Okay, how is it that someone who is under 18 was allowed to have a credit card? It's not normal. Something like that. So it's really, and you have obviously a button to download the full report if you need it. So it's really trying to maximize the value that you can get from using Hopsworks as a platform to store all of your Great Expectations validation reports. So let's look maybe at a demo now. So I'm just gonna run a Colab notebook here. So I am running the Colab notebook. I have installed Hopsworks here. I have loaded the data. So it's just CSV files that are loaded into Panda data frames. And then I've done the minimum of feature engineering, just trying to infer the age and the time of the transaction by just merging two data frames together. And so now what we're doing is we're going to create a feature group to hold the data. It's the first step when using the feature store. So we can import Hopsworks, we can run hopsworks.login, and it's going to ask me for an API key. And if you don't have an API key, you should go directly to app.hopsworks.ai, and you can register for free, and you can get a free account with which you can start using Hopsworks and try it out. And then you go on account settings, and you will just create a new API key here. I have an API key, so I'm just gonna go there, copy it, and now I'm connected to my Hopsworks account. And just like that, I can create a feature group. So I've just created it, has version, it has a small description. I tell it which one is the primary key, so the credit card number, and I can tell it a couple of other stuff like the event time, for example, and here it's date time, so it avoids data leaks when you're creating training data sets. And now I can just try it out, and I can run the insertion of my data set, and I can see, okay, the feature group was created. I can go to the UX and see, okay, this is my feature group. This is all the features that I have in it. So the city, the country, has a fraud label, has the amount, it has a transaction ID. Okay, and it doesn't have any data validation yet that is attached. And here you can see also you have the alert where you can add different alerts if you want to ruin your work-life balance. So, and you can see that the job that is inserting the row, it's inserting a single row into this feature group has been launched, and it has filled the backfilled the group. So we have a feature group. It's great. We have already inserted one row in it, and now we want to define our data validation. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to reuse as much of Great Expectation as possible. So we are just, Great Expectations is installed as soon as you install Hopsworks. And we are obviously going to use Great Expectation API to define the data validation. So the Great Expectation has a data frame wrapper that I cannot recommend enough. Once you wrap your data frame in this wrapper, you will have a lot of convenience methods that are just a different type of expectation, allows you to get to explore your data interactively. It gets autocomplete, so that expectation that you didn't know exist gets auto-completed. It helps with the keywords. It's really great for anyone who needs to get up to speed with Great Expectation rapidly. And so you can see, okay, you have this data frame, you run this expectation, so you want to see if the values are increasing, so the date time to see maybe if something has been sorted properly, and it's stored in a validation result. And when you run it, you can see that expectation config, the success is false. Okay, so it wasn't sorted properly. Here you can define your expectation suite. So you have an empty expectation suite. You can fill this expectation suite with the interactive expectation that you were working with by using part of the result that was provided. Or you can add the expectation just with this method. So you provide just an expectation configuration, and you have a bunch of different expectations that are ready-made and supported by Great Expectation. So it can be, the values have to be unique for transaction ID, for example. That's really useful to know which transaction is fraudulent or not. You want to make sure that the label for fraud is true or false. But you also have maybe things that are more sanity check. So you want to see that the amount and the minimum is 0, for example, because you want to make sure that someone in accounting doesn't just decides to stop having absolute values for the amount and starts having minus and plus sign depending on whether the money leaves or enter the account or something like that. And then you have maybe things that are like expect column value to be null, to just count the amount of null value so that you have an idea of like what is the quality of the underlying data. So really a lot of different options, and it's really easy with the Great Expectation API to populate the expectation suite and to then use it to validate a data frame. So that's that's basically all that is required to define your expectation suite. And so now what are we doing? Well, we want to use this expectation suite to validate every data that is going to be inserted into the transaction feature group. So our transaction feature group, we call the transaction feature group, let's say the expectation suite method, and we provide the Great Expectation object. And here we tell it to use a default ingestion policy of always. So when we run that, we will get back a link so that we can go and check our feature group again. And if we check our feature groups, it has the same feature, it has provenance. And here at expectation, you can see that we have an expectation suite that is configured and that no validation of reports or results have been uploaded yet. And you have a small edit expectation suite where you can add or remove expectation in the UX. If you are maybe more comfortable with UX than with code, then it can be a good way for some people to contribute if they've noticed a bug and just need to update the expectation suite. So that's it for that. So you can see that the expectation suite has been registered. And now when you call insert, again, it's the same code that was running before when the expectation suite was not registered. And here you can see that, oh, a validation report has been saved. Explore summary here. So again, you are sent to the feature group page, and you can see that in the expectation section, and now there is a feature group, and the feature group had 7 expectations and 4 successful, 3 unsuccessful, and everything was ingested. And then if you click on the little eye, you can have a preview of, okay, what worked and what didn't work. And that way you can really have a quick look at, okay, there was an exception for the category. Age of transaction seems like someone who's under 18 is using their credit card. Bad, up. So here, immediately, even before the values are finished inserting, you're getting directly value to be able to check whether you made a mistake, maybe in your feature engineering pipeline or in your prototyping, and your data are not how you expect them to be. And that's really providing feedback immediately and allowing you to iterate really fast when you're at the early stage of a prototype. And here, that's how you drive value from that. And you can see that really we didn't, and if you were to call insert to start a different notebook and just connect to Hopsworks, get this feature group, and insert another data frame without registering the expectation suite, it would also do this validation, because now this expectation suite exists in the Hopsworks backend. So before, when you're calling insert, it talks to the backend to check whether there is an expectation suite. And if one was registered before, even if it's in a different notebook, it will just perform the validation using this expectation suite. And here what we're doing is now trying to look at what happens when we move to the strict ingestion policy. And so we attach the new expectation suite. We can edit it in the same place, but here you can see that validation report saved successfully, but then there is no insertion job. And that's just because we've moved to strict, and we can click here and see that, oh, the validation report was not a success. And so we have something that is rejected. And that's completely fine. It doesn't make, it's not, I mean, it is the purpose of the strict keyword. It should show that the validation report was not a success, so we don't insert the data into the feature group. There are a couple of convenience methods, essentially getting the latest report or getting all the validation reports with some fancy start time and stop time. If you want to maybe put this report then into a data frame to do some more investigation on them. But essentially, that's the purpose of the integration, is to reduce any hurdles into using Great Expectations with Hopsworks. And you can see that now, if you're using Great Expectations, or you're using Hopsworks, there is just no reason not to connect the two. It takes one line. So yeah, that's as good as it gets, I guess. So yeah, here that was the end of the demo. Please join our Slack community, ask us any question if you are a company and are interested in having a feature store because you think that you can maximize the utility of your data engineer team. Please come talk to us. You can scan the QR code directly. Sign up for app.hopsworks.ai if you want to try it yourself. It's really as simple as it gets. Just run a Google Colab notebook, create your API key on app.hopsworks.ai, and just start using it. Start writing a high quality feature to your feature store. And if you're a data engineer and is excited about doing less data validation, then contact us. We reduce the amount of data validation that you will have to do. You will never have to do no data validation, but with Hopsworks, you can do less of it. So that's great news. Yeah, I can answer a couple of questions maybe. We have questions about whether we can use profilers. I guess you mean Great Expectations profiler. So yeah, I mean, Hopsworks does not essentially support profilers, but the fact is that profilers in Great Expectations are a way to automatically generate like a standard expectation suite that matches your data. And so you provide a sample of your data and you run the profiler and it will say like, oh, okay, this is a numerical column. So I will just add automatically to the expectation suite, like minimum, maximum, mean, standard deviation, blah, blah, blah. And so it generates a valid expectation suite that you can then register with Hopsworks. So we don't particularly support profiler, but as long as it generates an expectation suite that works, it's good for you. It's good for us. Another question regarding data validation of that are already in the feature store. Okay, I mean, yes, I think I've insisted quite a bit on the fact that it's not probably best practice. However, I can see how you might want to do it. Like you might want to check how data validation on the data that you're inserting is different than the data that are already in the feature store. So I can see how there could be like an incentive to do that. So one thing that you can do that actually. So you can create, let's call it full DF, and you can so feature group are not the ideal read for the feature store, but we can do it like that. I encourage you to look a bit at read and the different keywords that it have to avoid downloading gigabytes of data to your local machine on a small internet connection. But so that essentially gets the data that are in the transaction feature group and read them into a Panda data frame. And then what we can do is validation report. We want to sorry, I'm not so great at multitasking, so you will have to bear with me a bit. So here I'm calling the validate method of my feature group. And the validate method of my feature group is essentially a method to that can validate a sample of data that you pass to it. So here it's the data that we got from the feature group, but it can be data that you maybe you've changed your data engineering pipeline and you have a new updated feature and you want to see if it breaks the data validation that you have before you start inserting again, or you want to check on a smaller sample first that the validation runs before you start doing the insertion or something like that. So you can use this validate method and it automatically retrieve the expectation suite that exists with attached to this feature group. And if it exists, it does the validation, and you can ask the method to also save the report to the feature group. So then you can call the valid this, and now you have validate, and so you can explore summary here, and you will see that again we have another validation report, and it was rejected. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, you can do it. You can look at, okay, how does my expectation suite behave on the full data versus on just the data that I want to ingest. Like, for example, if you have them, you want to look at the mean of a batch versus the mean of what is currently in the feature store, it can be something that is interesting to perform. I would say that it's more data monitoring in that point and not so much data validation, and that anything that has to do with checking that data is correct should be done before it gets into the feature store, so that everyone who uses data into the feature store can find high quality data, because and that's how maybe business analysts or scientists will want to look for value. They will want to look at maybe amount, and if you do that, the 10 feature groups that match this category, and there are 4 features that have the name amount, and they different versions, and here I have description and a name. It's both in the description and in the name. So yeah, so there is really a lot of value in having this central repository of features, and if you put good quality data in, you will affect every user downstream. And that's really the power of the feature store, is that with 5 data engineers, you can provide good quality features to 5 data scientists instead of having 25 data engineers providing features to 5 data scientists and 5 models. So yeah, that's all for today. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good evening.